On the morning of April 12, 1859, in the small coastal town of Westerly, Rhode Island, a fisherman named Jacob Marsh pulled his boat to shore and noticed something peculiar in the sand near the rotting pilings of an abandoned dock. At first, he thought it was a child's doll, left behind by some careless family visiting the beach. But as he approached, the object moved. It was a boy, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, wearing clothes that seemed oddly formal for a morning on the shore. A buttoned vest, woolen trousers, and leather shoes that were worn but intact. The child was staring at the horizon with an expression Marsh would later describe as neither frightened nor curious, but simply present, as though he had always been there and always would be. When Marsh asked the boy his name, the child looked up and said, in a voice that seemed too steady for his size, "Thomas Wren." That encounter would mark the beginning of one of the most documented yet inexplicable cases in 19th century American medical history, a case that would challenge the understanding of time, growth, and the very nature of human biology itself. Because Thomas Wren, as records would later confirm, did not age. Not for days, not for months, not for years. And the question that would haunt everyone who met him was not simply how this could be possible, but why no one seemed able to stop it, or even fully explain it. Jacob Marsh brought the boy to the local constable, a man named William Godfrey, who assumed the child had been abandoned or lost during a recent storm that had battered the Rhode Island coast. Ships had been damaged, families displaced, and it was not uncommon for children to be separated from their parents in the chaos. Godfrey took the boy to the town's modest orphanage, run by a widow named Constance Elderfield, who had spent 2 decades caring for the forgotten children of Westerly. She noted in her logbook that Thomas arrived on April 12, 1859, and that he appeared to be approximately 4 years old, with dark hair, pale skin, and gray eyes that seemed older than his face. She also noted something else, something that seemed trivial at the time but would later become significant. The boy's hands were cold, even though the day was warm. Over the following weeks, Constance attempted to find Thomas's family. She placed notices in local newspapers, contacted neighboring towns, and even reached out to the few churches that kept records of births and baptisms. No one came forward. No one recognized the name Thomas Wren. And no parish had any record of a boy matching his description. It was as though he had appeared from nowhere, fully formed, with no past and no origin. But it was not until several months had passed that Constance began to notice something deeply unsettling. Thomas did not grow. He did not gain weight. His hair did not lengthen. His clothes, which had fit him perfectly in April, still fit him perfectly in September. At first, she dismissed it as coincidence, perhaps the result of poor nutrition or some hidden illness that slowed his development. But by the winter of 1859, when other children in the orphanage had visibly matured, some losing teeth, others growing taller, Thomas remained exactly as he had been the day Jacob Marsh found him on the shore. Constance began to keep detailed measurements, recording his height, weight, and even the length of his fingernails every 2 weeks. The numbers never changed. Not by an inch, not by an ounce. And when she shared her observations with the town physician, a man named Dr. Amos Hartley, he dismissed her concerns as the anxieties of an overworked caretaker. Children grow at different rates, he told her. Some are simply slower than others. But Constance knew this was different. She had raised dozens of children over the years, and she had never seen anything like Thomas Wren. By the spring of 1860, a full year after Thomas had arrived, the townspeople of Westerly began to take notice. Rumors spread quietly at first, whispered in the market square and discussed in hushed tones after Sunday services. Some believed the boy was cursed, that he carried some dark affliction inherited from parents who had abandoned him out of fear. Others thought he was touched by God, preserved in childhood as a living testament to innocence. The more superstitious residents avoided the orphanage entirely, crossing to the other side of the street when they passed its gates. And when Dr. Hartley finally agreed to examine Thomas more thoroughly, he found nothing medically abnormal. The boy's heart beat steadily. His lungs were clear. His reflexes were normal. His appetite was modest but consistent. There was no sign of disease, no indication of malnutrition, and no physical deformity that might explain his arrested development. Hartley was baffled. He consulted medical texts from Boston and Philadelphia, searching for any documented cases of halted growth. But the few examples he found involved infants who had died within months, not children who remained perfectly healthy. Thomas Wren was an anomaly, a living contradiction to every understanding of human biology. If you enjoy uncovering stories lost in darkness, don't forget to subscribe to Withered Truths and leave a like. Word of Thomas's condition eventually reached beyond Westerly, attracting the attention of Dr. Samuel Whitmore, a physician and naturalist from Providence who had spent years studying unusual physiological cases. Whitmore was a man of science, educated at Harvard and deeply skeptical of folklore or superstition. He arrived in Westerly in the summer of 1860 with a notebook, a measuring tape, and a determination to either debunk the rumors or document something unprecedented. He spent 3 weeks observing Thomas, conducting daily examinations, and recording every detail of the boy's physical state. What he discovered both fascinated and disturbed him. Thomas's body, by all measurable standards, was functioning normally, yet it was not changing. His bones were not lengthening. His muscle mass was not increasing. Even his hair, which Whitmore cut on the first day of his visit, had not grown back by the end of the 3rd week. Whitmore was forced to conclude that Thomas Wren existed in a state of biological stasis, a condition for which there was no medical precedent and no scientific explanation. But Whitmore also noticed something else, something that troubled him more than the boy's lack of growth. Thomas's behavior was unervingly consistent. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were measured and deliberate. He never laughed, never cried, and never showed fear. He moved through the orphanage like a shadow, observing but rarely participating. And when Whitmore asked him direct questions about his past, where he came from, who his parents were, what he remembered, Thomas would simply say, "I don't know," in a tone that suggested neither confusion nor distress, but a quiet acceptance of his own ignorance. Whitmore published his findings in a regional medical journal later that year, describing Thomas as a child suspended in time, neither progressing nor regressing, existing in a state that defies the natural laws of growth and decay. The article attracted attention from physicians, theologians, and curiosity seekers across New England. Some proposed that Thomas suffered from an unknown endocrine disorder, a failure of the glands that regulate development. Others suggested he was the victim of some environmental toxin, perhaps absorbed during infancy. A few religious leaders argued that Thomas was a sign, a divine message warning humanity of its hubris. But no one could offer a definitive explanation, and no treatment or intervention seemed capable of altering his condition. Thomas Wren had become a medical mystery, a living question mark that seemed to challenge the very foundations of biological science. By 1861, as the nation descended into the chaos of the Civil War, the attention on Thomas began to fade. Westerly, like many small towns, turned its focus to more immediate concerns. Sons being sent to battle, economies being strained, families being torn apart. Constance Elderfield continued to care for Thomas, though she confessed in letters to friends that she sometimes felt as though she were caring for a ghost, a presence that existed but did not fully participate in life. And as the months turned into years, the boy remained unchanged. By 1863, 2 full years after Whitmore's article had been published, Thomas looked exactly as he had on the day Jacob Marsh found him on the shore. He was still the same height, still wore the same clothes, and still spoke in the same measured, distant tone. The other children in the orphanage had grown older, moved on, or been adopted. But Thomas stayed, always the same, always present, and people began to wonder, what would happen if he never aged at all? The question that haunted Constance, and later the few researchers who continued to follow Thomas's case, was not simply biological but existential. If a human being could exist outside the normal flow of time, what did that mean for identity, for memory, for the soul itself? Thomas had no past that he could recall, and no future that seemed to approach. He existed only in the present, a perpetual child with no childhood to look back on and no adulthood to anticipate. Psychologically, how does one understand such a state? Dr. Whitmore had theorized that Thomas's mind might be locked in the same stasis as his body, unable to accumulate new experiences in a way that would allow for emotional or intellectual growth. but observations suggested otherwise. Thomas learned new words, adapted to routines, and responded to changes in his environment. He was not frozen mentally, only physically, and that made the mystery even more profound. Because if his mind could develop while his body could not, then what defined him as human? Was it his consciousness, his physical form, or the relationship between the two? In 1864, a journalist named Margaret Fielding traveled to Westerly to write an article for a Boston newspaper about the boy who never ages. She spent several days interviewing Constance, reviewing medical records, and observing Thomas from a distance. In her published piece, she described Thomas as a child who exists in defiance of nature's most fundamental rule, that all living things must change, grow, and eventually perish. But Fielding also noted something that previous observers had missed. Thomas, she wrote, seemed aware of his own condition. When she asked him if he knew he was different from the other children, he looked at her with those gray, unblinking eyes and said, yes. When she asked if it bothered him, he said, I don't know what it feels like to be bothered. Fielding found the response chilling, not because it was hostile, but because it was so detached, as though Thomas existed in a realm where ordinary human emotions could not reach him. She concluded her article with a question that would resonate with readers for years. Is Thomas Wren a boy? Or is he something else entirely? The Civil War ended in 1865, and America slowly began to rebuild. But Thomas Wren did not. By now, 6 years had passed since his arrival in Westerly, and he remained 4 years old in appearance. Constance Elderfield was aging, her health declining, and she began to worry about what would happen to Thomas after she was gone. She had no legal authority to claim him as her own, and no family had ever come forward to take responsibility for him. In 1866, she wrote to Dr. Whitmore, asking if there were any medical institutions that might be willing to take Thomas in, not as a patient but as a subject of ongoing study. Whitmore responded with a letter that was both compassionate and bleak. He wrote that while there were institutions that might accept Thomas, they would likely treat him as a curiosity, a specimen to be examined rather than a child to be cared for. Whitmore advised Constance to keep Thomas where he was, in the only home he had ever known, even if it meant he would remain there indefinitely. And so she did. Share in the comments. What country are you in and what time is it right now? But as the 1860s gave way to the 1870s, a new and troubling pattern emerged. Thomas, who had once been the subject of fascination and concern, began to be forgotten. The few medical professionals who had documented his case moved on to other interests. The townspeople of Westerly stopped talking about him. Even Constance, now in her 70s, began to accept his presence as simply part of the fabric of daily life, no more remarkable than the ticking of a clock or the changing of the seasons. Thomas became invisible not because he disappeared, but because people stopped seeing him as strange. He was simply there, always the same, always present, and people grew accustomed to the impossibility of him. And perhaps that is the most disturbing aspect of the Thomas Wren case. Not that he defied the laws of nature, but that the world eventually stopped caring. In 1873, Constance Elderfield passed away in her sleep at the age of 74. Her death marked the end of an era, and the orphanage was closed shortly thereafter. The remaining children were sent to other institutions or placed with foster families. All except Thomas. No one wanted him, not because he was troublesome or ill, but because he was inexplicable. And people fear what they cannot explain. He was transferred to a state-run facility in Providence, a place that housed the mentally ill, the physically disabled, and the socially unwanted. There, Thomas was given a small room, 3 meals a day, and little else. The staff treated him with a strange mixture of pity and unease, unsure whether he was a patient, a prisoner, or something else entirely. And there, in that anonymous institution, Thomas Wren continued to exist, unchanged, unaging, and largely unnoticed. The records from the Providence facility are sparse, but they do contain a few references to Thomas over the years. In 1875, a nurse noted that Thomas had been at the facility for 2 years and had not grown, even a single hair's breadth. In 1878, a visiting physician examined Thomas and concluded that his condition remained medically inexplicable and biologically unprecedented. In 1880, a journalist attempted to interview Thomas for an article but was denied access by the facility's administrator, who stated that Thomas was not to be disturbed or exploited for public entertainment. After that, the trail of documentation grows cold. There are no more medical reports, no more newspaper articles, and no more letters discussing his case. Thomas Wren, the boy who never aged, simply vanished from the historical record. What happened to Thomas after 1880 remains unknown. Some researchers have speculated that he died, his body finally succumbing to whatever mysterious force had kept him suspended in time. Others believe he was transferred to another institution, perhaps one outside of Rhode Island, where records have since been lost or destroyed. A few have suggested, with a mixture of hope and dread, that he might still be alive somewhere, still 4 years old, still unchanged, still waiting for an answer that will never come. But the truth is, no one knows. And perhaps that is fitting, because Thomas Wren was always a question without an answer, a mystery that could not be solved by science, religion, or reason. But before we accept that silence, it is worth considering what the case of Thomas Wren reveals about the limits of human understanding in the 19th century. The 1800s were a time of rapid scientific advancement, a century that saw the development of germ theory, the theory of evolution, and the foundations of modern medicine. Yet despite all of this progress, there were still phenomena that defied explanation. Thomas Wren was one of them, and the fact that he was eventually forgotten, rather than explained, suggests something troubling about how societies deal with the inexplicable. When something cannot be understood, it is often easier to ignore it, to let it fade into obscurity, than to confront the uncomfortable truth that there are aspects of existence that lie beyond the reach of human knowledge. The medical community of the 19th century operated within a framework that was both groundbreaking and deeply limited. Physicians understood anatomy and physiology far better than their predecessors, but they still knew almost nothing about genetics, hormones, or the complex biochemical processes that govern growth and development. Dr. Samuel Whitmore, for all his skill and dedication, had no tools to analyze Thomas's blood, no way to examine his cells under a microscope, and no understanding of the endocrine system that regulates aging. He could only observe, measure, and document. And when observation failed to yield an explanation, he was left with nothing but speculation. In his private notes, which were rediscovered in a Providence archive in the 1920s, Whitmore admitted that Thomas's condition haunted him for the rest of his life. He wrote that he often woke in the middle of the night, thinking about the boy, wondering if there was some detail he had missed, some clue that might unlock the mystery. But there never was. And eventually, even Whitmore stopped looking. The psychological dimension of Thomas's case is equally troubling. If he was, as all evidence suggests, fully conscious and aware of his surroundings, then what must it have been like to live in a body that never changed? Children grow because their bodies are designed to grow. It is a biological imperative, as fundamental as breathing or eating. But Thomas was denied that imperative. He was trapped in a state of perpetual childhood, unable to mature, unable to experience the physical and emotional changes that define human development. And yet, he did not seem distressed by this. In every account, from Jacob Marsh's first encounter to Margaret Fielding's interview, Thomas is described as calm, detached, and emotionally neutral. He did not cry for his parents. He did not rage against his condition. He simply existed, as though he had accepted a reality that no one else could comprehend. But was that acceptance genuine, or was it a form of psychological defense, a way of coping with an existence that would have driven anyone else to madness? Modern psychology recognizes that trauma can manifest in emotional numbness, a dissociative state in which the individual withdraws from reality as a means of self-protection. Could Thomas's detachment have been a response to some deep, unspoken trauma? Perhaps he had witnessed something horrific before arriving in Westerly, something that shattered his sense of self and left him emotionally frozen. Or perhaps his condition itself was the trauma, a biological anomaly that disrupted the normal development of his psyche. But without access to Thomas himself, without the ability to ask him questions or observe his behavior over an extended period, these remain only theories. What we do know is that he was alone, utterly and completely alone, in a way that few human beings have ever experienced. He had no family, no friends who could truly understand him, and no future to hope for. He existed in a permanent present, with no past to remember and no future to anticipate. And that kind of isolation, that kind of existential loneliness, might be the most disturbing aspect of his story. The cultural context of the mid-19th century also shaped how people responded to Thomas. This was an era when religious belief was still deeply intertwined with daily life, and many people viewed unusual phenomena through a theological lens. Some saw Thomas as a miracle, a child preserved by divine will for reasons only God could understand. Others saw him as a curse, a punishment visited upon his family or upon the town itself for some unspoken sin. The idea that a child could stop aging was not merely strange. It was blasphemous, a violation of the natural order that God had established. And in a society where the natural order was seen as a reflection of divine law, Thomas's existence was not just a medical mystery but a spiritual crisis. Ministers preached sermons about him, using his case as an example of the limits of human knowledge and the mysteries of God's creation. But others saw him differently, as a warning, a sign that humanity had overstepped its bounds and was now facing consequences it could not control. The press of the era, though far less sensationalized than modern tabloids, still played a role in shaping public perception of Thomas. Articles about him appeared sporadically throughout the 1860s and 1870s, each one repeating the same basic facts: his age, his appearance, his lack of growth, but adding little new information. The tone of these articles shifted over time. In the early years, they were written with a sense of wonder and curiosity, as though Thomas were a puzzle waiting to be solved. But as the years passed and no solution emerged, the tone became more skeptical, even dismissive. Some journalists suggested that the entire story was a hoax, that Constance Elderfield had simply been mistaken about Thomas's age, or that he was suffering from a rare but mundane condition like dwarfism or a thyroid disorder. But these explanations did not hold up to scrutiny. Thomas was not a dwarf. His proportions were normal for a child his size. And thyroid disorders, while they can slow growth, do not halt it entirely. The truth was that no one wanted to accept the implications of Thomas's condition, because accepting it meant acknowledging that there were limits to human understanding, that some mysteries might never be solved. Who do you think was truly behind this? Was Thomas the product of some unknown biological process, or was there something more deliberate at work, something that transcended the boundaries of science and reason? The question may seem absurd, the kind of thing that belongs in folklore rather than history, but it is a question that haunted those who knew Thomas. Because his case was not simply unusual, it was impossible. And when the impossible occurs, people begin to wonder if there is some hidden force at play, some intentionality behind the phenomenon. Could Thomas have been the subject of some experiment, conducted by individuals or organizations unknown? The 19th century saw the rise of secret societies, fringe medical practitioners, and alchemists who believed they could unlock the secrets of eternal life. Could Thomas have been the victim or perhaps the product of such an experiment? There is no evidence to support such a theory, but the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. And in a case as strange as this, it is difficult to rule anything out. Another possibility, one that has been raised by modern researchers looking back at the case, is that Thomas suffered from an extremely rare genetic mutation, one that disrupted the normal processes of aging and growth. In recent decades, scientists have discovered several genetic conditions that can cause accelerated aging, such as progeria, or conditions that delay puberty and growth, such as constitutional growth delay. But none of these conditions match Thomas's symptoms. He did not age rapidly, nor did he age slowly. He did not age at all. His body remained in a state of perfect stasis, showing no signs of degeneration or development. If such a condition exists, it has never been documented in modern medical literature. And that raises another troubling question. If Thomas's condition was genetic, where did it come from? Who were his parents, and did they carry the same mutation? Could there have been others like him, scattered throughout history, who simply went unnoticed or were explained away as miracles or curses? The disappearance of Thomas Wren from the historical record after 1880 is perhaps the most frustrating aspect of the entire case. In an age when records were kept meticulously, when births, deaths, and even minor medical ailments were documented in ledgers and journals. How does a person simply vanish? One possibility is that Thomas died, and his death was either not recorded or recorded under a different name. Institutions in the late 19th century were often chaotic, and it was not uncommon for patients to be listed incorrectly or for records to be lost. Another possibility is that Thomas was moved to a private facility, perhaps one run by a wealthy individual or organization interested in studying his condition. In such a case, records might have been kept confidential, or they might have been destroyed when the facility closed. But there is also a third possibility, one that is more disturbing and harder to dismiss, that Thomas simply walked away. If he truly did not age, if his body remained perpetually youthful, then he might have been able to leave the facility unnoticed, blending into the world as just another child. And if that were the case, then where did he go? What became of him? The lack of closure in the Thomas Wren case has made it a subject of fascination for researchers, writers, and amateur historians for over a century. In the 1920s, a historian named Edwin Marsh, no relation to Jacob Marsh, the fisherman who first found Thomas, attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the case. He traveled to Westerly, interviewed descendants of people who had known Thomas, and scoured archives for any mention of the boy. But he found little new information. Most of the people he spoke to had only heard stories, passed down through generations, and the details had become embellished or distorted over time. Some claimed that Thomas had been seen in Westerly decades after his disappearance, still looking like a child. Others said he had been taken by the government and hidden away in a secret laboratory. A few even suggested that he had never existed at all, that the entire story was an elaborate myth invented to explain some other, more mundane event. But Edwin Marsh believed otherwise. In his final report, published in a small academic journal in 1931, he wrote that the evidence for Thomas's existence was overwhelming, and that the boy's disappearance was not a mystery but a tragedy. "We did not lose Thomas Wren," Marsh wrote. "We abandoned him." In the decades since, the Thomas Wren case has been revisited periodically by researchers in various fields: medicine, psychology, sociology, and even philosophy. Each discipline brings its own perspective, its own theories, and its own questions. Medical researchers wonder if Thomas's condition might someday be replicated or understood through advances in genetics or cellular biology. Psychologists are fascinated by the question of identity and consciousness in a being who does not develop physically. Sociologists examine the case as an example of how societies deal with the abnormal, the inexplicable, the unwanted. And philosophers ask the deepest question of all: what does it mean to be human? Is humanity defined by the body, which grows and changes and eventually dies? Or is it defined by the mind, the soul, the essence of consciousness that exists beyond the physical form? Thomas Wren challenges all of these definitions, because he was both fully human and something entirely other. He had a body, but it did not age. He had a mind, but it was trapped in a form that could not mature. He had a presence, but no place in the world. Why would such evidence be buried for decades? Why would a case as extraordinary as Thomas Wren's be allowed to fade into obscurity, rather than being studied, preserved, and understood? The answer may lie in the discomfort that his existence provoked. People do not like to be reminded of the limits of their knowledge. They do not like to confront phenomena that cannot be explained, because such phenomena undermine the sense of control and understanding that allows them to navigate the world. Thomas Wren was a living reminder that there are things we do not know, things we cannot predict, and things we cannot fix. And rather than live with that discomfort, it was easier to forget him, to let his story slip through the cracks of history, to allow time to do what it could not do to him: erase his presence from memory. But memory is not so easily erased. The story of Thomas Wren has persisted, passed down through whispers and fragments, preserved in dusty archives and forgotten journals. And every so often, someone stumbles upon his name, pulls at the thread of his story, and asks the questions that no one else wanted to ask. What happened to him? Where did he come from? Why did he stop aging? And most importantly, could it happen again? These questions do not have answers, and perhaps they never will. But they continue to haunt, because they touch on something fundamental, something that exists at the core of human existence. the fear of the unknown, the desire for understanding, and the recognition that some mysteries are simply beyond our reach. If you had known the truth, would you have stayed silent? Would you have done what Constance Elderfield did, caring for Thomas quietly and without expectation of answers? Or would you have demanded an explanation, insisted that science and reason find a solution, no matter how long it took? The question is not rhetorical. It forces us to consider what we value more, the comfort of certainty or the courage to live with uncertainty. Thomas Wren lived his entire life in uncertainty, with no past to ground him and no future to guide him. And those who cared for him, those who documented his case, had to live with the same uncertainty, knowing that they would never understand what had happened to him or why. That takes a kind of courage that is rare, a willingness to accept that some things cannot be known. The 19th century was an age of answers, or at least the pursuit of answers. It was a time when humanity believed that reason and science could eventually explain everything, that every mystery could be solved if only the right tools and the right minds were applied to the problem. But Thomas Wren stood as a quiet refutation of that belief. He was the question that could not be answered, the problem that could not be solved. And in the end, he was forgotten, not because he was unimportant, but because he was too important, too unsettling, too challenging to the worldview that people wanted to maintain. His story forces us to ask whether we are truly seeking understanding, or whether we are simply seeking comfort, the reassurance that the world is knowable and that we are in control. And if the answer is the latter, then perhaps we have not come as far as we think. In recent years, there have been occasional reports of children who seem to age more slowly than normal, whose growth is delayed or stunted for reasons that doctors cannot fully explain. None of these cases approach the extremity of Thomas Wren's condition, but they remind us that the human body is still capable of surprising us, of defying expectations, and of behaving in ways that we do not yet understand. Modern medicine has made tremendous advances since the 19th century. We can now sequence genomes, manipulate cells, and even slow certain aspects of the aging process. But we still cannot stop aging entirely, and we still do not fully understand why it happens in the first place. Aging is one of the fundamental mysteries of biology, a process that seems universal yet remains deeply complex. And if Thomas Wren truly did stop aging, then his case represents something even more profound, a challenge not just to medical science but to the very nature of life itself. The final question, the one that lingers long after all the facts have been examined and all the theories have been proposed, is this: what did Thomas Wren think about his own existence? Did he understand that he was different, that he was trapped in a body that would never change? Did he feel the passage of time, even as his body did not reflect it? Did he dream of growing up, of becoming an adult, of living a life that was denied to him? Or had he, in his quiet and detached way, accepted his fate, surrendered to the impossibility of his condition, and found some kind of peace in simply existing? We will never know. The boy who never aged left no diary, no letters, no record of his inner thoughts. He remains a mystery, not just in body but in mind and spirit. And perhaps that is the most fitting end to his story. Not with answers, but with silence, the same silence that surrounded him throughout his life and that followed him into whatever unknown place he went after 1880. Thomas Wren was a child, but he was also a symbol. He represented everything that humanity fears and everything that humanity desires. The fear of stagnation, of being trapped, of never moving forward. And the desire for permanence, for youth, for a life that never ends. He was both a warning and a dream, a reminder that some gifts are curses and some curses are gifts, and that the line between the two is often impossible to see. And in that ambiguity, in that refusal to be easily categorized or understood, Thomas Wren continues to exist, not in flesh and blood, but in the questions he left behind, the unease he provoked, and the mystery that will never be solved.